Last week, we discussed the emergence of what I referred to as a medieval synthesis, that is, a bringing together of distinctive conceptions of ritual, of overall meaning, and of ethics into a new constellation of Christianity. And as we saw, the foundation of that medieval synthesis was the practice of ascesis, of training, of a discipline that would bring one closer to God. As a result of the development of that practice during the Middle Ages, there emerged a distinctive understanding of how it was that one could become at one with God. What is the actual method by which atonement is achieved? And in this regard, the Middle Ages saw a distinctive teaching which had not been present before. It built, as is usually the case, on earlier tradition. The teaching of Origen during the 3rd century had seen the idea that at the time that Jesus was crucified, his death on the cross was an actual payment for sin. That his willingness to pay for sin, although he was personally innocent, meant that others did not have to pay for their sins. As Origen understood it, this payment for sin could only have been made to that one supernatural figure who always insists on getting paid. And that, for Origen, is Satan. At the time of Christ's death, Satan is paid off. And because he's paid off, Satan's power on other sinners is broken. This became a dominant conception during the period of Catholic or Orthodox Christianity, prior to the Middle Ages. Sometimes, in fact, you will see it rippling up to the surface in modern theology. If you want to understand the very last scene of Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, you have to understand Origen's teaching. It is grounded in that conception. But this conception underwent an extraordinary change during the 5th century, and you can see this within the first box, and especially under the influence of the Bishop of Alexandria at that time, whose name was Cyril. Cyril, as a bishop, was known for his ability to galvanize Christian mobs in order to accomplish his will. Christian mobs could take out a synagogue. They might decide to kill a local Neoplatonist philosopher, as occurred in the case of Hypatia. You can see that particular instance within the box. And the reason for this was that, as Cyril of Alexandria understood it, the payment which is required for sin isn't actually to Satan, as Origen had taught. Instead, this payment is to the just power of God. God actually wants sacrifice. He wants sacrifice for sin. And that is his payment, so that his justice is maintained. And one can see this in a passage from the Hebrew Bible, which had long been understood as a mirror of what was happening at the time of the crucifixion, namely Genesis 22, when Abraham nearly sacrifices his son Isaac. According to Cyril, Abraham wimped out. According to Cyril, God actually himself wants that sacrifice. And so he writes, as you can see within the quotations, the child being led to the sacrifice by his father indicates through symbol and outline that neither human strength nor the greed of the conspirator, that's Satan, led our Lord Jesus Christ to the cross, but the desire of the Father. This is truly God's will. And therefore, the story of Genesis 22, as it stands in the Hebrew Bible, is a kind of evasion. We should actually accomplish this sacrifice, which is indicated, as he says, by means of symbol and outline. This notion of God receiving the sacrifice, the payment for sin, became dominant during the Middle Ages and was codified in the case of Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who died in the year 1109. And he developed what came to be called the theory of a ransom. That is, the idea that Jesus paying his life was a ransom for the sins of others. Today, when you hear fundamentalists tell you that one of the fundamental teachings of the Bible is that Jesus died on the cross in order to pay personally for your sins, they may not know it, but they are quoting an Archbishop of Canterbury. They're not citing anything within the Bible. Wouldn't you know, the one Archbishop of Canterbury they decide to quote was unbelievably wrong-headed. This shift meant that everything that a believer did should be understood as a form of atonement, of constantly giving up in payment in order over the course of a lifetime to become at one with God. One could so influence God that not only was one's current life made better, but one's afterlife could be influenced. And this is what brings us to the teaching of Purgatory over on page 2. Here, too, there was a major shift as you move from the period of classic Catholic and Orthodox Christianity to the period of the Middle Ages. In the earlier period, the idea of purgatory was that people had to be purged, that people had to be purified even after death, so that one was engaged in a constant process of living in the crucible of a moral purification, both in this life and in the next life. But in the Middle Ages, purgatory became conceived as a place where one would pay for lesser sins. In other words, if the sin involved were mortal, you had no chips to cash in. You were simply placed in hell, and good luck to you. On the other hand, if the sins were not mortal, but nonetheless they were substantial, they would be purified in purgatory. But if it's possible within one's life to have an influence on God by constantly being willing to pay for one's own sins in the imitation of Christ, surely that would mean that I could have an influence on the amount of time that I spent in purgatory and the amount of time that my loved ones spent in purgatory. Why could I not fast on behalf of someone else? Why could I not undertake a pilgrimage, both to assuage my own future and also to help those departed in my family out of purgatory at an earlier stage? If I were to acquire a relic of one of the saints, would my acquisition be an act of such virtue that I would be released from the consequences of my sin. It may interest you to know that the Elector of Saxony, who was the primary protector of Martin Luther, had the largest collection of relics in his area. And one of the reasons that he rejected the idea that only papal agents could get you out of purgatory was that he wanted his relics to have good business. And if people constantly went to the papal agent, they wouldn't be visiting his schloss, his castle, in order to see the magnificent collection of thousands of relics that he had put together. Because the conception was that teachers within the church, in particular the Pope, could say, if you venerate a relic, if you acquire a relic, if you go on the pilgrimage, if you support the building of St. Peter's, if you engage in another major act of mercy, such as a crusade, then that would release you from the consequences of purgatory. This is the conception of the indulgence, which during the Middle Ages came to be seen in particular as associated with the power and the authority of the papacy. As a consequence of that, as you can see on the bottom of page 2, we have by this period of medieval synthesis what appears to be an extremely stable system. You know, the feeling one gets very often, reading not only documents from the Middle Ages, but also documents about the Middle Ages, was that it was a period of remarkable stability. Although when you look at conditions on the ground, you become a bit dubious about that generalization. But the reason for the impression of stability is the conception within Christendom that there is such a thing as a single identity of Christian, and that it links together, first of all, an understanding of what it means to be a human being, which is set out in Orthodox creeds. This is the period in which it is held that we know whether or not you are a Christian if you recite the creeds. If you fail in that regard, you're clearly a heretic, and you don't belong. You are simply one of the infidels. Infidel comes to be used as a very general conception. It includes Jews, Muslims, heretics. They're all included. And one can act against them in a way that is indiscriminate. So, for example, yes, there was a crusade against the Muslims to free, that was the conception, the Holy Land. On the other hand, there was also a crusade led against a group of Christians in France called the Cathar, the pure. They did not uphold Cathar, the pure. Yeah. Okay, south of France. The Pope who decided there'd be a crusade against the Cathar was named Innocent III. In one particular case, in the city of Béziers, which was predominantly Catholic, the citizens of that city decided they would give protection to the Cathar. The Cathar had set themselves up as opposing papal authority, and they refused to pay the tithe. Those were the days. They were surrounded by the papal agent of the crusade. They were besieged. The city was set on fire. Every inhabitant of the city, Cathar and Catholic, was put to death. 15,000 people in one day. The papal agent was asked, but what about those who are Catholic, not Cathar? And he answered, the Lord will know his own. When you say that orthodoxy is the meaning of human existence, you mean that these creeds are literally a matter of life and death. And the course of your activity, if we shift over to the left-hand side, to ethics, the course of one's activity should be centered on this newly emergent idea of atonement, of paying during the course of one's life to God in order to recompense one's own sin. And what you do in this life directly influences your own future after death and also those of your loved ones. And under ritual, you'll notice that we are no longer focused on baptism and Eucharist. Rather, there are an entire host of sacraments. Pilgrimage is a sacrament. Increasingly, confirmation is seen as a sacrament. Holy orders, ordination is seen as a sacrament. During this period, Hugh of St. Victor counted up not 7, but 84 sacraments. All different ways in which you could engage in finding atonement by means of payment to God. So you had what appeared to be a remarkably stable, one might say totalitarian system of the understanding of Christendom. And exactly as it emerges, we see it giving way to something radically new, which I have called today the medieval apocalypse. And I say that because it comes out of teaching related to the Revelation to John, the last book in the New Testament. One reason it came about was that as the Middle Ages reached this synthesis in 1095, when Pope Urban II preached the crusade, he was laying the seeds for major change. Urban himself put crusading at the very top of what you could do to win a papal indulgence. He says, just looking at that first paragraph in the box at the top of page 3, remission of sins will be granted for those going there if they end a shackled life either on land in crossing the sea or in struggling against the heathen. I, being vested with that gift from God, grant this to those who go. Let those who are accustomed to wage private wars wastefully, even against believers, go forth against the infidels in a battle worthy to be undertaken now and to be finished in victory. Everyone who's decided to make this holy pilgrimage and has made a promise to God and has vowed that he will pour himself out to him as a living, holy, and pleasing sacrifice must bear the sign of the cross on his front or breast. Anyone who, after fulfilling his vow, wishes to return must put the sign on his back between his shoulder blades. You were literally marked out as a cross bearer, a crusader, and Urban's promise was, I can forgive you the consequences of sins up until the time that you go on the crusade and what you might do during the crusade. Just what you want to say to an adolescent male. No particular mystery why the Crusades saw extraordinary degrees of atrocity. And I would point out that there is no sign whatever of the teaching of jihad, such as we see it in Islam, until the time of the Crusades. That is, what we think of today as native to Islam is in fact an import from the Crusaders. This notion that jihad takes the place of all other virtues, that's not in the Quran. But it is in the teaching of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was responding to the Crusades. What occurred during this period was an outbreak of such violence that the primary commentator on the Apocalypse, on the Revelation to John, whose name was Joachim of Fiora, taught that St. Augustine had it wrong. St. Augustine had taught that when we read at the end of the Revelation to John in chapter 20, when we read that there is going to be a time when the saints would reign with Christ for 1,000 years, Augustine said, that would be us. We are in the 1,000-year reign of the saints, what Augustine called Christiana Tempora, the Christian epic. Joachim taught, actually, we are not there yet. How could we say we are there yet? When there is so much violence around us, when there is clearly strife within Christendom itself, we see the old capital of Constantinople weakened. During the period of the Crusades, Constantinople was even sacked by crusaders. The crusaders decided that they had to pay back a loan to their bankers in Venice, and to do it, the best way seemed to be to sack a city. It's a lot easier to sack Constantinople than it was to sack a Muslim city, so they turned to Constantinople. We're not in the millennium yet. That millennium is only to come, when, as Joachim says, as you can see, the Antichrist is to fall. And when Jews and many infidel peoples, as he says over on page 4, are converted to the Lord. We have to look ahead to that. And that will be a time when all of Christendom will be led by what Joachim of Fiora called the viri spiritualis, the men of spirit. No more force of arms, no more rule by wealth, rather spiritual men, contemplatives. Joachim died in 1202, before St. Francis became famous. But when Francis founded an order, there were those within the Franciscan community who decided St. Francis is the beginning of the millennium. St. Francis preached poverty. He taught humility. St. Francis was the first of the spiritual men, and they would come to rule Christendom, and they would replace the papacy. This was the prediction of an author who I have taken care to spell his name for you. As you see on page 4, Gerardo de Borgo Sandonino. He wrote what he called the Introduction to the Eternal Gospel. The eternal gospel in his mind was what Joachim of Fiora said. It's not an introduction to the New Testament. It's not even a commentary on the Apocalypse. It's a commentary on Joachim of Fiora, saying that St. Francis marks the emergence of a new kind of spiritual leadership which is going to completely change the church. In particular, Gerardo applies to St. Francis the identity of the angel of what he called the sixth seal from the Revelation of John, from Revelation chapter 6, where it said, the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and every slave and free person hid themselves in the caves, in the rocks of the mountains. And they say to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the one who sits upon the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, because the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Everything that has to do with wealth and power will be leveled. Gerardo argued that even within the Franciscan community, those friars who compromised with the powers of this world would be removed. And only the true poor Franciscans would remain. This was going to be what Gerardo called the Reformatio of the Church. 1254. We are centuries before Martin Luther. The Middle Ages, through its apocalypse, is producing not only the call for reformation, it's also providing the motivation for a reformation by saying God is not on the side of the papacy, not on the side of wealth, not on the side of status. The poor really are about to inherit the earth. So be prepared for that change, which Gerardo said would happen in 6 years. He predicted this shift in the year 1260. Why 1260? Because it says in the Revelation of John that the woman who bears a child and is persecuted by Satan, whom Gerardo understood to be the church, was in the wilderness for 1,260 days. There's a well-known shift, days, years. And so Gerardo taught 1260 would finally bring relief from oppression and the beginning of the millennium. What he got instead was the beginning of the Reformation, as we'll see next week. Thank you very much. Al Alstrom had a question. Before the lecture, he had a Lutheran question. I don't know if we'll have another Lutheran question. Oh, okay.
My first question is very brief, and if you answer it correctly, I have a second question.
Oh, okay.
Is there anybody who would, except for, let's say, saints or especially recognizable people, who would avoid purgatory?
Excellent question. Could you avoid purgatory? First, you might not want to. That is to say,
then you go to hell.
Yeah, because right. But also, you know, some of the things that we do in this life are not entirely pure, but they're nonetheless enjoyable, and they're probably worth a couple 100,000 years in purgatory, because after that you have an eternity in heaven anyhow. So, as long as you know you can get to the stage of purgatory, you're doing pretty well. And that's almost everybody you know. I don't mean Lutherans, I mean everyone generally.
I have had interpreted purgatory as a continuation of the sanctification process. So that, for instance, in other words, what should I say? I mean, for those who believe that sanctification is part of the process that sort of completes the sanctification.
Yeah, Al is saying that he had conceived of purgatory as completing the process of sanctification. And this is what Origen taught. This is what the Middle Ages takes and changes into something else. In Origen's teaching, we are even now in purgatory, which explains the morning you just had. In heaven, your soup is going to be on time. And think of the delay as a down payment, you see. We are even now in the midst of purgatory. We are purified, in the sense, not in the sense that we're being punished for Origen, but in the sense that you live in a moral crucible, right? Every decision you make is determining who you are and where you're going to go. That's why for Origen, the moral life and the spiritual life are one and the same. And after death, you continue in this process, which he compares to education. And here again, he doesn't think of university as punishment. He actually liked it. So his picture is, that purgatory, and he uses this phrase, purgatory is a school for souls. Because you have to grow up to the point where you can have the vision of God. What do you think? That you will have your present sensibility, you will die, and every scale will be lifted and you will understand all mysteries? Origen held, of course not. What's going to happen is that you will be schooled to understand more and more. He believed that we will be in a position where we will understand the secrets of the universe, where we can understand why the stars move as they do. He even thought he'd know the weather. What an optimist. And the idea was that after you had acquired more and more and more sensibility, then you would be prepared for the vision of God, which is the very content of heaven. So for Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century, purgatory is definitely a continuum. By the Middle Ages, it's much more as it is in Dante, where everyone has his little cubicle of pain, which he's going to have to sit in and pay until release is possible. That distinction in teachings of purgatory from Origen to Dante encapsulates what's going on during this shift in the Middle Ages. And because in many ways we still live in the Middle Ages, it's important to understand this. Yes, please, Melissa.
I think I heard you say that the idea of ransom is not included in Scripture. How about Isaiah?
You're thinking of Isaiah chapter 53.
Yes.
Yep. That because the servant described in Isaiah 53 laid down his life to death, therefore there was put on him the iniquity of us all. What it does not say, what Isaiah 53 does not say, is that the servant paid for the iniquities of others. The idea of payment, which is built into ransom, as when someone has been kidnapped or something like that, that appears only in the later period.
Well, isn't laying down your life the payment?
It is in the teaching of those who interpret Isaiah 53 that way. But in Isaiah 53, within the book of Isaiah, the servant is Israel. Within Isaiah, God has chosen Israel to be his servant. And when Isaiah speaks of the suffering of the servant, what he's doing is describing what Israel is going through in exile. And he is saying, in that exile, because one can see the righteousness of the servant, the surrounding nations are coming to understand God.
I thought the servant was Christ.
That becomes a later Christian interpretation, but it's not within Isaiah. And it's by taking that reference and changing it to Christ, and taking the reference to the illness of, see, the servant is sick. That's why he's disfigured, and his form isn't even human. You take the servant, you make him a person instead of a country. You take away his illness, you give him crucifixion. And then, instead of saying he makes many righteous, you say he pays a ransom. Well, yes, if you make all those changes, then you can find a ransom theory inside the book of Isaiah. If you make similar changes, you can find a ransom theory in the Gospel according to Mark. But no one actually articulates that theory until a much later period. It is, as I say, Anselm of Canterbury, in the form where the payment is to God. It is in the form of the payment is to Satan in the case of Origen. Yes, please.
Going back to the question about everybody going to purgatory or not, wouldn't one exception to that rule, even in the time of Origen, have been the martyrs who would have been granted beatific vision at death?
In the case of Origen, martyrdom is held to be, and he writes an entire tractate on martyrdom in which his purpose is to encourage people who are in the position where they might be martyred because of their faith. Even here, he does not conceive of martyrdom granting perfection. He sees it as something which is hastening one's own development, but that development is going to continue post-mortem. Yes, please.
Thank you. In your dealing with medieval ages and the Book of Revelations, how popular was the position that the book, most of what the Book of Revelation says happened on age 7, 70 AD, meaning Revelations was written before 70, obviously, which is one of the positions. How common was it in this book?
Right. Yet the questioner rightly says that there is a common position which holds that most of the events referred to in the Revelation of John occurred in the period prior to the writing of John's Revelation. That is, certainly on this theory, prior to 70, I would say prior to 100, when I actually think it was written. I think the Revelation of John presupposes the temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed. That's why when John has the vision of the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven, there is no temple there. His conception is God himself and the Lamb, they are the temple. There in the city, no building is required. But it has become a widely held position, represented recently, for example, by Elaine Pagels, that most of the events in the Revelation of John refer to figures such as Nero. Nero's probably the beast. I'm sorry, Tea Party. It's not Barack Obama. It really is Nero. And one of the reasons for Elaine Pagels making this argument is to take away this understanding that you can take a figure in the deep future and say, I've got it. It's Barack Obama. It used to be Mikhail Gorbachev. You know, he has the mark of the beast. Yeah, it was perfect. Who could resist? But in the time of the Middle Ages, when Joachim was writing, he believed when he was looking at the seven-headed beast in Revelation chapter 17, he believed that 5 of those heads had already come and gone. 1 was in power, and there was not much more time to go because the final head was the Antichrist. There was one occasion when Joachim of Fiora was meeting with Richard III. Richard III was on his way maybe to a crusade. The effort was to convince Richard to take the crusade. He was an amazingly unstable character. He understood as little about his own motivations in relation to the crusade as he understood in relation to his own sexuality. He was a very interesting character. On this occasion, he'd actually come into a meeting of the bishops stark naked in order to confess his homosexuality. So he's a troubled man. And he's meeting with Joachim of Fiora. And Joachim of Fiora actually shows him a picture, because Joachim made pictures. Shows him a picture of the beast with the 7 heads. And he says, the Antichrist lives even now. And when he says the Antichrist, he means the final head. Once this head is broken, that's when the millennium comes. That Antichrist has already been born, Joachim said, and he's living in the vicinity of Rome. So you see how easy it was to make him into an anti-papal interpreter of the apocalypse. So in the Middle Ages, most of them think John of Patmos was referring to events that were future from John's point of view, but the majority of those events are past from our point of view. We aren't yet in the time when it was argued that everything John spoke of was in the past. Yes, please, Bob.
In talking about the millennium, so far you or did any of these writers, was this the return of Jesus
Oh, absolutely. It's referred to in the Revelation of John as the first resurrection, that Jesus appears with his saints, and those saints rule the world for 1,000 years. Then after that 1,000 years, Satan is briefly released from his chains in order to be completely destroyed, and that's the second resurrection, when the most of us have a chance.
Is Satan and the Antichrist the same?
In Joachim's, this is a good question, in Joachim's understanding, Satan and the Antichrist are the same. This is not a universal understanding by any means, but at this time, the notion of evil had evolved to the point where it was seen as being a remarkably coherent and fearsome force. That evil is not just normal, common, or garden variety badness. That there's, in the end, evil is a conspiracy. And the chief conspirator is Satan himself. He really is running the forces of evil that are around us. Yes, please.
Would you agree that purgatory is not a biblical concept? It is not found in the Bible.
Oh, without question. The question was, isn't it true that purgatory is not found in the book? Quite true. Purgatory is not there. We talked about ascesis last week. Ascesis is not there. We're not up to it yet. We're going to get to it next spring. Next spring we'll talk about the rapture. The rapture is not there. So Christianity, in all of its periods, is without question a system that develops out of the Bible with other influences. But there's no prospect of rooting all of its teachings directly within the Bible. I completely agree with that.
There is also no creedal basis. Descended into hell. We don't have it descended into purgatory.
No, quite right. Yes, it does not appear in any of the commonly used creeds. It does in the later ecumenical creeds. Yeah.
It seems to be more of a papal, what would I say? A papal means of controlling and gaining power over the people.
This encapsulates the position of Martin Luther. And we're going to see, and Al is very happy, and we're going to see next week that Martin Luther puts the case against the papacy and against purgatory and against the veneration of the saints in exactly these terms. He sees them as being anti-biblical extensions of human power and therefore to be resisted root and branch. And in the end, what does he use in order to illustrate this corrupting influence of the papacy? He uses the revelation of John. He identifies the Pope as the Antichrist. In other words, Martin Luther stands in the tradition of Joachim of Fiore. Yes, please.
Is one of the other influences Aristotle?
Aristotle is, especially during this period, an influence not on Joachim, but rather on Thomas Aquinas. And the reason, paradoxically, for the revival of Aristotle is the Crusades opened up the learning of the Muslim world to Europe. And there had been translations of Aristotle which had not survived in Europe, which did survive within Baghdad. And those materials came to the West, translated into Greek and into Latin. They influenced thinkers, especially around the University of Paris. First, Albertus Magnus, and then his student, Thomas Aquinas. Exactly. So you began to have a revival of Aristotle in the West, which meant the revival of science, which meant the weakening of church power as a result of the Crusades. Don't you like God's sense of humor? Well, I'm getting this gesture from Fred, whom I'm sure is pining for soup. And so I think we'll break there and take up with the Reformation proper next time out. Thank you very much.